Right, hi everybody. So third and final lesson looking at the poor laws, and our title today is How Successful Was the New Poor Law? So we're going to evaluate the implementation of this new piece of legislation. It's the new poor law because that distinguishes it from the earlier pieces of legislation starting in 1601, which we looked at last lesson. So it's the new poor law, or it's the Poor Law Amendment Act, because it changed an existing poor law. So we're going to look at how the poor law changed Britain today. We're going to describe how it was implemented, how it was put into place. Secondly, I'm looking at success criteria now. We're explaining the reasons why there was opposition to this law. And thirdly, we've got an opportunity to do a little bit of sources practice, looking at the evidence on this. And the question to kind of think about really here is this just a Starvation Act? Is this just a law that punished people for being poor? So in order to access this particular lesson, you'll need that photocopied handout again. It's the last time you'll need it, but a lot of the information comes from that once more. It would be useful to have your textbook to hand as well. So that can either be the physical Pit to Peel textbook, which is orange, or I know a number of you now have got access to the electronic version. Either is absolutely fine. There's a map attached to the lesson. It's just an outline map of Britain. So if you can't access it, just to sketch a map out if you can, and if you can possibly print that, that'd be great to have in your notes. And as usual, pen and paper. When you've gathered all of those things together, you are ready to start. Okay, so also attached on Go for Schools was the clip that's mentioned here in slide 2. It's a good bit of Tony Robinson history. He visited a Victorian workhouse. So just have a watch. The questions are really just designed to get you thinking. You don't have to write down the answers. So what kind of jobs did people do within the workhouses? So the oakum picking looks particularly awful. Why were those jobs chosen? Oh, and the stone breaking. Although I don't know, maybe the stone breaking I would be okay at that. Because there's a certain amount of pent-up anger that could be released, but the oakum picking would be tedious in the extreme. And thirdly, consider what might have been the effect of doing these jobs on the people in the workhouse. So there are the physical and mental effects of having to do those kind of things. Okay, so when you've had a little, you can pause this, have a little watch of that clip. As I say, the link is on Go for Schools for you. And then once you've watched the clip, come back to the lesson. Okay, so nice to see you all back, raring to go. Hopefully you enjoyed the clip on the worst jobs, which focused on the workhouse. So I'm going to do a little bit more research now using that photocopied chapter. And the task here, pretty straightforward, is to construct a mind map. So you're going to need a whole page for this. We're putting effects in the middle, and then we're looking at 6 different aspects of the poor law. So what the routine was like within the workhouse, how the inmates felt about being in the workhouse, the environment, so the buildings themselves, what it was like inside. So any information you can find on that. There's some great plans. So most workhouses were built based on Kempthorne's map, and there's a picture of his plans in your photocopied chapter that you can have a look at. The food, what kind of food did they get given? The cost, so did the workhouses succeed in driving down the cost of care for the poor? Because that was one of the big aims of the new poor law. Attitudes to the workhouses. So what did people at the time think of them? So it's directed you to look at page 151 to 156. Don't panic. A lot of that is sources. So there's some really interesting pieces of evidence across these pages, taken from the time. And of course that's important for you guys, because this whole section of the paper is looking at your ability to analyse evidence. You won't have to write an essay on the workhouses. You might have to do a sources paper on it though. So hence why a lot of the information is now based on looking at contemporary evidence. But yeah, there's some really interesting pieces of evidence. So I'll leave you to have a look at it, but you might come across source 9.26, which is quite a good example of attitudes to the workhouse, because it shows a riot outside a workhouse in Stockport, showing obviously very negative attitudes amongst the ordinary people. The other one I quite like looking at is source 9.31, which is pictures of 2 contrasting workhouses one in Hampshire and one in London, and also 9.33, which is the map that I've told you about, the kind of plan for the building of the workhouse, and you can see how the children and adults are separated, the genders are separated, etc. And I always quite like the daily timetable and the menu, the food they got. So have a look at the sources and complete your mind map. So pause here and go away and get on with that. Hi everyone, so hopefully your mind map's looking nice and full now. And if I can just direct you to your textbook as well, page 153 through to 156 in your textbook also has lots of interesting information on the poor law and the workhouses. So again, you've got the report book from Andover, you've got a picture of the Andover workhouse. That was quite an infamous case, wasn't it, where they found the paupers chewing on the rotten bones that were supposed to have been crushed for fertiliser. And the paupers were so hungry that rather than crush the bones, they'd actually tried to eat the rotten meat and marrow off them. And of course, when that came out, it caused a public outcry that these people were being treated so shamefully. Yeah, so there's some further information. 155 to 156 is useful as well because it just goes over what the workhouses were like. So it may be that you want to just pause again, have a quick look through the text. You can skim read the textbook and add any useful information to that mind map. And when you finish that, it should be looking really full of facts. Okay, so hello again. Hopefully your mind map was a success and is looking great. Final thing really on this before we kind of move on to some source analysis is just looking at geographical variations, because the implementation of the new poor law was patchy, to say the least, across the country. So if you want a reminder of what the new poor law said, we ended with it last lesson, but there's a handy scroll on page 150 of your photocopied chapter, and it just goes through quite clearly what the regulations were. So outdoor relief, that's handouts, would continue for the old and the infirm, so people who were too ill or too disabled to work. So they could stay within their homes and the parish, or now it's the union, the local area, would help them out. Outdoor relief would be abolished for the able-bodied. So if you were fit and unemployed, you would get no handout at all. Conditions within the workhouses were to be made less eligible than for labourers on the lowest pay. So if you were fit and able-bodied, there was no handout whatsoever. Your only option was to go into your local workhouse, and conditions in there should be worse than they are for somebody that's in work. There was a kind of sense of, social fairness, if you like. So conditions inside the workhouse were deliberately bad because they wanted people to work where possible. A central poor law commission based in London would administer or carry out the law, and 3 commissioners would be appointed, and their job was to travel around the country and check whether these new rules and laws were being adhered to, were they being followed. Parishes will be joined together to form a poor law union, and each union would have one workhouse. Because if you remember, with over 15,000 separate tiny parishes, that just was not efficient and not an efficient way to organise poor relief. So parishes are no longer responsible, instead it's the unions, and they are bigger areas. The workhouses would be run by an elected board of guardians, and they would employ, so somebody would be paid to be the master and matron of the workhouse. And there were 7 classes of pauper within each workhouse, and they had to be kept separately. So it's men and women, boys and girls, separated by age, and also the infirm, the ill people would be separated out. So as you can see on the slide, the next thing we'd like you to do is just finish off reading your handouts. This is page 157 and 158 and 159 actually. There's a little bit, it was just a summary really. So 157 and 158, and this it's paragraphs now rather than lots of sources. So it just sums up really a review. And you've got 4 comprehension questions there to try and answer. And again, if you need a little bit of help with that, you've got your textbook that you can refer to. So in your Pit to Peel textbook, you want page 157 to 158 again. I haven't made that up, it is the same pages. Wow. Okay, so just pause here, have that slide on your screen, and that gives you the questions that we would like you to work through, please. Okay, so hopefully you got your answers to your questions down. So you, again, making some nice meaty notes on the poor law. I just want to draw your attention to this source. I mentioned the workhouse at Andover previously, and you can see there it's just popped up on the slide in red. So it was kind of right down the south of the country in Hampshire, this particular workhouse. And it became infamous rather than famous because of the cruelty that was discovered there. So if you have a look at source A, and it's a fairly reliable, well, it is a reliable source, it's not fairly, because it's from a report of the Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry. So it is an official document written up, for central government to talk about how the workhouses and how the poor law were being implemented. So content, it says, some of the inmates were in the habit of eating raw potatoes and grain and food which had been thrown to hogs and fowls, so in other words, the pigs and chickens. Instances occurred in which the inmates employed in bone crushing, so they were to grind animal bones to make fertiliser, ate the gristle and marrow off those bones. So it's a pretty damning indictment suggesting that actually this principle of less eligibility had gone too far. And in some workhouses, not all, some workhouses, the conditions were cruel and inhumane. So final thing for you to think about, just in terms of doing a bit of review and evaluation, how successful were the poor laws? So thinking about everything you've read, economically, did they save money? Because one of the aims of this law, these laws, or this amendment to an existing law, was to cut down the cost of poor relief. So what evidence can you find in your notes, in your photocopied chapter, or in your textbook, that actually the cost of poor relief did reduce after 1834? Second thing to consider, and give it a mark out of 10 and briefly say why. Second thing to consider, socially. So what was the impact on people? What was the impact on poor people for these poor laws? Essentially, they were treated as criminals, weren't they? The impact on families that were unfortunate enough to find themselves, temporarily unemployed. So have a little think about that, mark out of 10 with a reason why. Thirdly, politically. So what was the impact on the government? How were the government, this is a Whig government, remember. So in 1834, this is the Whig government that are in power, not Robert Peel. But however, Peel did support this legislation as a Tory. So how did it make the government seem? And finally, so again, mark out 10. And finally, law and order. So we know about the riots at Stockport. I also suggested that you might want to have a look at the Rebecca Riots. So again, a little bit of review and think to yourself, okay, well, there were riots. There were outbreaks of violence in retaliation to this law, in opposition to this law. However, the authorities in the end overcame those isolated riots and the law carried on. So on balance, what would you give out of 10? Okay, so that concludes your notes and your work on just gathering information. And now we need to just do a little bit of practice on applying that information. So same lesson, and we're moving on to number 3 on our success criteria, evaluate a range of sources. So hopefully we feel that we've achieved 1 and 2. We've described how the poor law was implemented, and we've explained reasons for opposition. And next thing we want to do is just practice having a look at some sources. So if you have a look at your textbook this time, so page 155, you've got sources P, Q, R and S. And actually, if you've been looking at your textbook during the lesson, you will have come across these sources anyway. So using the 4 sources in their historical context, assess the view the new poor laws were a success. So it's kind of like mocking up a paper for you on this, just to kind of have that bit of a practice. So you can comment on source content, the provenance, so the nature, the origin, the purpose and reliability, and also making sure that you place the source in context using your own knowledge. So canop, okay. And we're back in the room. Okay, so once you've written up that first paragraph, the sources that suggest it was a success, you're on to the second paragraph, the sources that suggest the poor law really wasn't very much of a success. And to keep things simple, you've probably come to the conclusion that R and S are the obvious ones to go for. You might slip a little bit of Q in there, because Q does admit that there were riots. Source R says misery is running riot, and it talks about the inhumanity. And source S basically says it will cause a revolution, that all the poor people will rise up and attack the Tories that are in charge. So again, using the sentence starters there, have a little practice. What does the source say? How reliable is it? What does the provenance suggest about it? How strong is it as a piece of evidence? Can you apply a little bit of own knowledge? Okay, so pause here, do that second little paragraph. Okay, welcome back everybody. So a little bit of a conclusion to finish off. So in conclusion, the sources taken as a group either do or do not support the view that the new poor law was a success. So that's your decision based on the quality of the evidence you've looked at. It's not about how many sources, remember, it's about how good they are. So don't just add them up, it's not maths. So which source agrees most with the view that you've outlined there in that opening sentence? Which source is least valuable, do you think, in terms of its quality, and why is that? Which source is the most reliable, and why is that? So you have to get used to basing your conclusion on the evidence, not just on your own opinion, okay? And then you obviously bring in a little bit of your own knowledge and make that final judgment. So pause here, write up your conclusion. Okay, everybody, well done. You've worked hard today, or I hope you have anyway. Final slide, just checking that we're happy with everything that's been covered today. So the title for today's lesson was How Successful Was the New Poor Law? So hopefully you feel that you've now got lots of ideas in your head that would help you to answer that question. The success criteria, you should be able to describe how the new poor law was put into practice. You should be able to describe the workhouses, how they were organised, what they looked like, what the food was like, the daily routine. Second success criteria, explain reasons for opposition. So why did different groups not like the new poor law? And third success criteria, you should have practiced evaluating a range of sources as evidence. So a little kind of practice sources paper at the end there using that set that were in our textbooks. And the stretch and challenge, was the new poor law simply a starvation act? Okay, something for you to think about. And those of you that feel able might want to just finish off your notes by jotting down some ideas on that. Again, you could do a yes, no, or you could just, jot down some ideas as they are in your head. And when you got your information from today's lesson, you should have, just to recap, your mind map looking at kind of features of the new poor law. You should have your answers to the comprehension questions, and which was about kind of opposition to the poor law, and you should have your annotated map, which looked at how geographically the law was put into practice in different areas of the country. So, and then you should have a practice answer on the sources as well. So all of that information can go into your folders, please. Just as if you were in school. You've got hopefully a really nice set of notes there, and that concludes our work on the poor law. So Mr. Thomas and I will be having a conversation about whether we want you to do a full sources paper on that. So look out for that. And our next topic that we'll be moving on to will be looking at conditions inside the factory, so working conditions in the factories and the mines. So I will look forward to talking to you again soon.